Hello, I am Karen Newell, and this is Ted Pettis. This is part 1 of the Pterygopalatine Fossa. In this first segment, we will demonstrate the walls of the Pterygopalatine Fossa, the openings in those walls, and the arteries that pass through those openings. Part 2 will cover associated nerves.
The maxillary artery is not the longest artery in the body, but it has many branches. As always, a simplified drawing helps us get started on a complicated topic.
Guerrilla Graphics.
Hello, I am primatologist Robert C. Sturkes, and this is my assistant and anatomical artist, Gunther. Today, we are going to show you how to draw the maxillary artery. The superficial temporal and maxillary arteries are terminal branches of the external carotid. The maxillary artery has 3 divisions. First, before the lateral pterygoid. Second, overlapping the lateral pterygoid. And third, after the lateral pterygoid muscle. You need to know the entire artery for anatomy class, but for this lesson we focus on the third, or Pterygopalatine part. Great job, Gunther. Mint? I suggest you pause for the next 5 minutes until you can write and name these branches. We will be using these names in the next section like you know them.
Let's take a closer look.
Tetis, Pettis, Minimus. Hi, Tiny Ted. How's the view?
Wow! The view is amazing.
Tiny Ted is at the right side of the skull. Let's remove the zygomatic arch. Zygomaticus, remove us.
Well, the mandible is still in the way.
Mandibularis, disappear us. Ah, now we can see where the third portion of the maxillary artery is going. Look between the lateral pterygoid plate and the maxilla. That vertical opening is the Pterygomaxillary Fissure. It's the lateral passage to the Pterygopalatine Fossa, the space we're looking at.
Pterygopalatine? They use that same name for the third part of the maxillary artery that we were talking about.
The Pterygopalatine part of the maxillary artery is in the Pterygopalatine Fossa.
That actually makes sense.
Yep, but can you say that 3 times fast?
Oh boy. The Pterygopalatine part of the maxillary artery is part of the Pterygopalatine Fossa. The Pterygopalatine part of the maxillary artery is part of the Pterygopalatine Fossa. The Pterygopalatine part of the maxillary artery is part of what?
Me either.
I see the medial wall on the medial side of the fossa. It has a hole with a light shining through.
That is the Sphenopalatine Foramen. It opens to the nasal cavity.
Interesting. There is a back door passage between the face and the nasal cavity.
You know what is missing from this view? The maxillary artery, the thing we're talking about.
Look at that. The maxillary artery goes through the Pterygomaxillary Fissure into the Pterygopalatine Fossa. In there, it has 5 branches. Each of those branches exits the fossa through a different passage. I can see right away how the Sphenopalatine branch passes through the Sphenopalatine Foramen. I can see the opening, but let me get a closer look. There you are. I couldn't see you through the fascia. Let me clear some of this out of the way. That's better. Here I am in the Pterygopalatine Fossa. I came in through the Pterygomaxillary fissure in the lateral wall and am looking at the medial wall, the Sphenopalatine Foramen. See the Sphenopalatine artery going to supply the nasal septum. It's a branch of the maxillary artery here.
Yes, in the nasal cavity, that artery bifurcates into a septal branch for the nasal septum and a lateral nasal branch for the lateral nasal walls. Both of those anastomose with several other arteries that vascularize the nasal cavity. Now, turn 90 degrees, face the anterior wall.
Uh-huh.
Now, look up. That is the inferior orbital fissure up near the roof.
Nice fissure.
That is where the inferior orbital artery goes to the orbit.
In the orbit, it runs along the floor through the infraorbital groove, infraorbital canal, and then through the infraorbital foramen, out to the face. That is a path that covers 3 dissections, this one, plus the orbit, and the face. Ask your colleagues for some peer teaching on those other topics.
Now turn 180 degrees and face the pterygoid process of the sphenoid bone, the posterior wall of the Pterygopalatine Fossa.
There are 2 passages.
The one way up high and lateral, almost in the roof, is the foramen rotundum. Remember what runs through the foramen rotundum?
Not an artery. Maxillary nerve.
Well done. That is very important. But since no maxillary artery branches pass through it, we will come back to it. For the next foramen, look inferiorly and medially along the posterior wall.
That is the infamous pterygoid canal we talked about in association with the greater petrosal nerve. That is the route for autonomic nerves to this fossa. That's my favorite nerve.
You are correct. But keeping the focus on the arteries, the artery of the pterygoid canal also passes through on its way to the middle cranial fossa. It is a maxillary artery branch we drew earlier. Now look down at the floor of the Pterygopalatine Fossa. It is a narrowing funnel-like passage that has 2 openings through the palate at the inferior end. The greater palatine foramen anterior to the lesser palatine foramen. See how this descending palatine artery splits into the greater and lesser palatine arteries? The greater goes anteriorly to supply the hard palate, and the lesser goes posteriorly to supply the soft palate. We can see the route of the descending palatine artery in the wall of the nasal cavity. Looking up at the palate, we see the greater and lesser palatine foramina and associated arteries. Okay, we have one more branch to account for. Look back at the lateral wall.
Looks like we forgot some fascia. I'm looking laterally through the pterygomaxillary fissure. I can see the maxillary artery coming at me.
You should also see the smaller posterior superior alveolar artery exiting through the fissure.
Here it is.
The posterior superior alveolar artery leaves back out of that fissure. Keep following it to see that it dives into a tiny little foramen on the posterior maxilla. It travels in the maxillary sinus to supply the upper teeth and lining of the maxillary sinus.
There it is. I see it on the maxilla.
Officially, where it penetrates the maxilla in the infratemporal fossa, not the Pterygopalatine fossa. Some sources may be vague on that distinction. This artery leaves the fossa via the fissure, but it leaves your sight via foramen in the maxilla.
Okay, let me get this straight. The maxillary artery enters the Pterygopalatine fossa via the Pterygomaxillary fissure.
Yes?
And 5 major branches all have to exit some way. 4 of them exit via 4 different passages.
Yes?
And 1 of them exits the same way the maxillary came in, the Pterygomaxillary fissure, right?
Yes, you are correct. The foramen rotundum is the only passage without a branch of the maxillary artery passing through.
Then I guess we are done. It's almost time to begin part 2 with the foramen rotundum and the maxillary nerve.
But the reasons we break this into 2 parts is that the nerves are very similar. If you take on both topics at once, it can cause more confusion than clarity. Take a moment to draw the maxillary artery, then draw a circle around each branch and name the foramen, canal, or fissure through which it exits the Pterygopalatine Fossa. Then do this by memory.
Once you know these foramen, the nerve courses will come much easier. Karen, can you beam me up?
Teres, pedis, maximus.